Have you ever witnessed a moment so raw, so unexpected, that it strips away years of carefully constructed public facades? Picture this, a room filled with cameras, dignitaries, and the weight of centuries-old tradition. The King of England, a man who has spent decades perfecting the art of royal composure, suddenly breaks protocol in the most human way possible. His hand reaches out, not for his wife, not for duty, but towards someone who represents everything he thought he had lost forever. This isn't a fairy tale. This isn't fiction. This is the true story of a moment when grief, regret, and raw human emotion collided with the most watched monarchy in the world. When Charles reached for Kate instead of Camilla, he didn't just break royal protocol. He broke open decades of carefully buried pain, revealing a truth that would forever change how the world sees the British royal family. What happened in that room wasn't just about a gesture. It was about a father's love, a daughter-in-law's grace, and the ghost of Diana that still walks the halls of every royal residence. It was about the weight of choices made, roads not taken, and the price of duty over heart. Are you ready to discover what really happened when the cameras caught something no one was supposed to see? When the most powerful man in Britain showed his most vulnerable moment. This is that story, unfiltered, authentic, and more powerful than any crown or title could ever be. Charles stood at the grand window of Windsor Castle, watching the morning mist rise from the ancient grounds that had housed his family for nearly 1,000 years. At 75, his reflection showed a man carved by decades of duty, expectation, and choices that had shaped not just his life, but the very future of the British monarchy. The weight of the crown, both literal and metaphorical, had never felt heavier than it did on this particular morning in March 2024. The events that would unfold later that day had been building for years, perhaps decades. They traced back to a love story that the world thought it knew, but really didn't understand at all. Charles had always been a man caught between two worlds. The world of duty that demanded he marry appropriately and secure the succession, and the world of his heart that had always belonged to one woman, Camilla Parker Bowles. But there was something else, something the public had begun to understand only recently. Charles had developed a relationship with his daughter-in-law Kate that went far beyond the typical royal family dynamics. She wasn't just William's wife or the mother of his grandchildren. Kate had become something Charles had never expected to find again after Diana's death, a bridge to the son he had struggled to connect with, and a reminder of what genuine warmth within the royal family could look like. The morning had started like any other state occasion. Charles had risen at 6, as was his custom, and spent an hour in his private study reviewing the day's schedule. The Commonwealth reception was set to begin at noon, with representatives from 54 nations gathering to celebrate the ongoing relationships between Britain and its former colonies. It was exactly the kind of event that Charles, with his lifelong passion for the Commonwealth, should have been looking forward to. Instead, he found himself thinking about a conversation he'd had with Kate just 3 days earlier. They had been walking through the gardens at Highgrove, his beloved countryside retreat, while William was inside taking calls about his latest environmental initiative. Kate had stopped beside the memorial garden Charles had created for his mother, the Queen Mother, and had said something that had stayed with him ever since. "You know, Charles," she had said, using the informal address he had long encouraged her to use in private, "I think about Diana often when I'm with the children. Not in a sad way, but in a grateful way. She left such a blueprint for how to be a royal mother, how to balance the duty with the humanity. I hope I'm making her proud." The simplicity of her words, the genuine emotion behind them, had moved Charles in a way he hadn't expected. Here was this remarkable young woman who had never known his first wife, yet who understood something about Diana's legacy that even he sometimes struggled to grasp. Kate had taken Diana's approach to royal duty, the hands-on charity work, the focus on mental health, the determination to raise her children with as much normalcy as possible, and had evolved it for a new generation. Charles had watched Kate navigate the complexities of royal life with a grace that reminded him daily of what he had lost when Diana died. Not just a wife, but a partner who understood that the monarchy's survival depended on its ability to remain relevant and relatable to ordinary people. Kate possessed that same intuitive understanding, that same ability to make people feel seen and valued, regardless of their station in life. The relationship between Charles and Kate hadn't developed overnight. In the early years of her marriage to William, she had been appropriately formal, correctly deferential. But as she had found her feet within the family, and particularly after she had given birth to George, Charlotte, and Louis, something had shifted. Charles had begun to see in Kate not just a daughter-in-law, but a kindred spirit who shared his love of history, his appreciation for tradition, and his concern for the monarchy's future. Their bond had been strengthened by Kate's approach to her children's relationship with their grandfather. Unlike some royal wives who might have felt threatened by the complex dynamics of the family, Kate had actively encouraged a close relationship between Charles and his grandchildren. She had made sure Charles was present for important milestones, had included him in family traditions, and had created space for the kind of informal, loving relationship that Charles had sometimes struggled to have with his own sons when they were young. William had initially been surprised by how well his father and wife got along. The relationship between Charles and Diana had been so fraught, so public in its difficulties, that William had perhaps expected some of that tension to carry over into the next generation. Instead, he had watched his father blossom in his role as grandfather, becoming more relaxed and openly affectionate than William could ever remember him being. The morning routine at Windsor continued as Charles moved from his study to the breakfast room. Camilla was already there, reading the morning papers and making her usual wry comments about the media coverage of their latest engagements. After nearly 20 years of marriage, they had settled into comfortable patterns. Camilla understood Charles's moods, his needs, his obsessions with organic farming and traditional crafts and architectural preservation. She had supported him through his mother's death and his assumption of the crown with unwavering loyalty and her characteristic practical humor. But even Camilla had noticed the special warmth Charles showed toward Kate. It wasn't romantic. Nothing could have been further from the truth. It was something deeper, more complex. Kate represented for Charles a chance to get something right that he felt he had gotten wrong the first time. She was the daughter-in-law who loved his son unconditionally, who was raising his grandchildren with wisdom and joy, who understood the weight of royal duty without being crushed by it. As Charles reviewed his notes for the speeches he would give that day, his private secretary knocked and entered with the final guest list for the Commonwealth reception. Charles scanned the names, noting the usual mix of high commissioners, government ministers, business leaders, and charity representatives. His eyes stopped at one entry: Their Royal Highnesses the Prince and Princess of Wales. William and Kate's presence at the reception wasn't unusual. They regularly supported Charles at major state functions. But Charles found himself looking forward to seeing Kate in a way that had become increasingly important to him. In a world where so much of his interaction was formal and prescribed, Kate brought something authentic and unguarded to their relationship. She asked about his health with genuine concern, remembered details about his interests, and wasn't afraid to disagree with him when she thought he was wrong about something. The morning passed in a blur of final preparations. Charles's valet helped him into his morning dress, the formal daywear required for such occasions, while his equerry briefed him on the key attendees he would be expected to recognize and speak with individually. The Commonwealth reception was one of the most important events in the royal calendar, a chance for Charles to reinforce Britain's ongoing relationships with nations that had once been part of the empire but now chose to remain connected through shared history and common interests. Charles had always felt a particular passion for the Commonwealth. During his years as heir, he had traveled extensively throughout the member nations, building relationships and understanding the unique challenges and opportunities that each country faced. As king, he saw the Commonwealth as perhaps Britain's most important soft power asset, a voluntary association of nations that chose to work together because they saw value in their shared connections, not because they were forced to do so by colonial power. But as he prepared for the reception, Charles's mind kept drifting back to that conversation with Kate in the garden. There had been something in her voice when she spoke about Diana, something that suggested she understood the weight of being compared to someone who had become, in death, almost mythical in the public imagination. Kate had lived with Diana's shadow for more than a decade now, and Charles had watched her find her own way to honor that legacy while creating something uniquely her own. The truth that Charles had come to understand, and that he would demonstrate so powerfully in just a few hours, was that Kate had become more than just William's wife or his grandchildren's mother. She had become a bridge between the monarchy's past and its future, between the formality of royal duty and the warmth of human connection, between Charles himself and the son with whom his relationship had sometimes been strained. As the time for the reception approached, Charles made his final preparations. He adjusted his tie, checked his pocket watch, a gift from his beloved grandmother, the Queen Mother, and took a deep breath. He had no idea that in just a few hours, a moment of instinctive human emotion would reveal to the world something that those closest to him had known for years. That in Kate, Charles had found not just a daughter-in-law, but a connection to everything he valued most about family, duty, and the future of the monarchy itself. The stage was set for a moment that would change everything, a gesture so spontaneous and honest that it would strip away years of speculation and reveal the truth about the relationships that really mattered within the British royal family. As Charles prepared to leave his private apartments and enter the formal world of state reception, he had no idea he was about to show the world his heart. The grand reception room at Windsor Castle had been transformed into a showcase of Commonwealth unity and British diplomatic excellence. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over polished floors where the flags of 54 nations created a colorful tapestry of shared history and diverse cultures. Staff members moved with practiced efficiency, ensuring every detail was perfect for what would be one of the most important diplomatic events of Charles's reign so far. Kate arrived at Windsor Castle 45 minutes before the reception was scheduled to begin, as protocol required. Her car swept through the gates and up the long walk, the ancient avenue that had witnessed centuries of royal arrivals and departures. As she stepped out of the vehicle, she paused for a moment to look up at the castle's imposing walls. Even after more than a decade as a member of the royal family, she still felt a sense of awe at the weight of history these stones represented. She was wearing a deep blue dress by one of her favorite British designers, chosen specifically for its subtle nod to the Commonwealth theme of the day. The color echoed the blues found in many Commonwealth flags, while the elegant cut reflected her understanding that today was about diplomacy and relationships, not fashion headlines. Her jewelry was equally thoughtful, a pair of sapphire earrings that had belonged to Diana, worn not for sentiment, but because she knew Charles would notice and appreciate the gesture. As Kate made her way through the castle's corridors toward the private family quarters where she would meet Charles and Camilla before the reception began, she encountered members of the household staff who had known her since her early days as William's girlfriend. The warmth of their greetings reflected the genuine relationships she had built over the years. Unlike some royal family members who maintained formal distance from staff, Kate had always made an effort to know the people who made the royal household function smoothly. "Good afternoon, Your Royal Highness," said Mrs. Patterson, the senior housekeeper who had been at Windsor for more than 30 years. "His Majesty is in the blue drawing room, reviewing the guest arrangements." Kate smiled and thanked her, but she could sense something in Mrs. Patterson's manner, a subtle tension that experienced royal staff developed when they sensed that important family dynamics were at play. The household staff often understood the emotional undercurrents of royal life better than the press or public ever could, and Mrs. Patterson had clearly picked up on something significant about today's event. When Kate entered the blue drawing room, she found Charles standing alone by the windows, looking out over the castle's east terrace. He was fully dressed for the reception, but something in his posture suggested a man deep in thought rather than someone preparing for a routine diplomatic event. Kate had learned over the years to read Charles's moods, and she could see that he was wrestling with something more complex than usual pre-event nerves. "Charles," she said softly, using the informal address that had become natural between them in private moments. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the entire Commonwealth on your shoulders today." He turned toward her, and she was struck by something in his expression that she hadn't seen before, a vulnerability that went beyond the usual pre-event tension. Charles had always been someone who felt the responsibility of his position deeply, but today there seemed to be something more personal at stake. "Kate," he said, and his smile seemed genuinely relieved by her presence. "You look absolutely perfect. That color is exactly right for today." He paused, studying her face with the kind of attention that suggested he was seeing something beyond just her appearance. "I wanted to thank you for what you said the other day in the garden. About Diana. About feeling grateful rather than burdened by her legacy." Kate felt a flutter of surprise. She had meant those words sincerely, but she hadn't expected them to resonate with Charles so deeply. "I meant every word," she replied. "I think about her often when I'm making decisions about the children, about my royal duties." She left such a clear example of how to balance being human with being royal. Charles moved closer, and Kate could see that her words had touched something profound in him. "You know, when William first brought you home, I hoped you would make him happy. I never imagined you would help heal something in our family that had been broken for so long." The conversation was interrupted by Camilla's arrival. Charles's wife entered with her usual brisk efficiency, already wearing her reception-appropriate jewelry and carrying the kind of practical confidence that had made her such an effective queen consort. She greeted Kate warmly. Over the years, Camilla had developed a genuine appreciation for Kate's approach to royal life and her positive influence on both William and Charles. "Are we ready to charm the Commonwealth?" Camilla asked with characteristic humor. "I've been practicing my small talk about trade relationships and cultural exchanges." The three of them spent the next 20 minutes reviewing the guest list and discussing the key relationships Charles hoped to strengthen during the reception. Kate listened carefully as Charles explained the significance of various attendees. The High Commissioner from Canada, who was dealing with complex constitutional questions about the monarchy's role, the representative from Australia, where Republican sentiment continued to simmer, the leaders from African nations where Charles's environmental initiatives had found enthusiastic support. What struck Kate was how personally Charles took these relationships. This wasn't just diplomatic protocol for him. These were real connections with real people who represented millions of citizens across the Commonwealth. She could see why he had spent so many years preparing for this role, and why the success of these relationships mattered so much to him personally. As they prepared to make their way to the reception, Charles's private secretary appeared with a final briefing note. William had been delayed by an unexpected meeting with his environmental foundation, but was expected to arrive within the first half hour of the reception. Charles nodded, but Kate noticed a flicker of disappointment cross his face. She knew how much Charles valued having his family present at these important occasions, and how much he particularly enjoyed seeing William and her work together as a team during official events. The walk from the private quarters to the grand reception room took them through some of Windsor Castle's most historic corridors. Kate had made this journey dozens of times, but today she found herself noticing details that seemed particularly significant. The portraits of previous monarchs who had navigated their own challenges in maintaining Britain's global relationships, the subtle symbols of Commonwealth nations incorporated into the castle's decorative schemes, the way centuries of tradition had been adapted to serve contemporary diplomatic purposes. As they approached the reception room, Kate could hear the murmur of conversation from the assembled guests. The sound created a sense of anticipation that she had learned to associate with important royal events. The particular energy that arose when people from different nations and backgrounds came together in the formal setting of a royal palace. There was always an element of theater in these occasions, but also something genuinely meaningful about the connections that could be formed when diverse groups of people were brought together in service of shared goals. Charles paused just before they reached the entrance to the reception room. "Kate," he said, "I want you to know how much your presence means to me at events like this. You have a gift for making people feel valued, and heard that reminds me daily why the monarchy matters to ordinary people." Kate was touched by his words, but she could also sense that they carried a weight beyond simple gratitude. There was something about Charles's mood today that suggested deeper currents were at play, emotions and memories that went beyond the immediate demands of diplomatic protocol. As they entered the grand reception room together, Kate was struck by the visual impact of the gathered assembly. Representatives from 54 nations, each bringing their own cultural perspectives and national interests, but all connected by the complex history and ongoing relationships that define the modern Commonwealth. The room buzzed with conversations in multiple languages, the energy of people who understood they were participating in something historically significant. Charles immediately moved into his element as host, greeting guests with the kind of personal attention that had made him an effective diplomat throughout his decades as heir to the throne. Kate watched him work the room, noting how he remembered personal details about individual guests, how he connected current events to larger historical patterns, how he made each person feel that their nation's participation in the Commonwealth was personally important to him. But even as she watched Charles excel in his royal role, Kate sensed something else, an anticipation, as if he was waiting for something or someone that would make the evening complete. She realized he was looking toward the entrance, hoping for William's arrival, and she felt a wave of understanding about how much family connections meant to Charles, especially during these formal occasions that could sometimes feel isolated and impersonal. The stage was being set for something significant, though none of them could have predicted exactly how the evening would unfold. As Kate moved through the reception, engaging with guests and supporting Charles's diplomatic objectives, she had no idea that within the hour, a moment of instinctive human connection would reveal to the world something profound about the relationships that really mattered within the royal family. The reception was about to become something much more personal and emotionally powerful than anyone could have anticipated. The Commonwealth reception had been flowing smoothly for nearly an hour when the unexpected moment began to unfold. Charles had been moving through the assembled guests with his characteristic blend of formal dignity and genuine warmth, engaging in conversations that ranged from trade relationships to environmental initiatives to cultural exchanges. The room buzzed with the energy of successful diplomacy, the kind of productive interaction that made these formal occasions worthwhile for everyone involved. Kate had been fulfilling her own role perfectly, engaging with spouses of high commissioners, learning about cultural programs from various Commonwealth nations, and providing the kind of gracious, informed presence that had made her such an effective representative of the royal family. She had a particular gift for making people feel comfortable in the sometimes intimidating atmosphere of a royal reception, and Charles had noticed throughout the evening how naturally she connected with guests from different cultural backgrounds. William arrived just as the reception was reaching its peak energy level. He entered the grand reception room with the confident stride that had become his signature over years of royal duties, immediately scanning the room to locate his father and wife. Charles's face lit up with genuine pleasure when he spotted his son, and Kate felt the familiar warmth she always experienced when watching the two men she loved most navigate their complex, but ultimately loving relationship. William made his way toward where Charles was engaged in conversation with the High Commissioner from New Zealand and several representatives from Pacific Island nations. The discussion was focused on climate change initiatives and the particular challenges faced by nations threatened by rising sea levels. Charles had been passionate about environmental issues for decades, and this was exactly the kind of conversation that energized him and reminded him why the Commonwealth's cooperative approach to global challenges was so important. As William approached the group, Charles instinctively reached out to include his son in the conversation, explaining the innovative approaches to renewable energy that several Pacific nations were pioneering. Kate watched the interaction with the kind of deep satisfaction she always felt when she saw father and son working together effectively. Their relationship had not always been easy. The pressures of royal duty and the shadow of Diana's death had created tensions that took years to resolve. But moments like this showed how strong their bond had become. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with William adding his own insights about youth environmental activism and the ways that traditional knowledge from indigenous communities was informing modern conservation efforts. Kate noticed how Charles's face relaxed as he watched his son engage expertly with the Commonwealth representatives, clearly proud of William's knowledge and diplomatic skills. It was during this moment of family harmony and successful diplomacy that everything changed. Charles had been gesturing toward a display about renewable energy projects when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence. His face went pale, and he appeared to lose his balance slightly. Kate, who had been standing several feet away in conversation with the wife of the Australian High Commissioner, immediately noticed the change in Charles's demeanor. What happened next would be analyzed and discussed for years to come, but in the moment, it was pure instinct. Charles, clearly feeling unwell and disoriented, reached out his hand, not toward Camilla, who was across the room engaged with a group of African representatives, not toward William, who was standing right beside him, but toward Kate. His hand extended across the space between them with unmistakable intent. In that moment of vulnerability, when formal protocol and careful royal positioning meant nothing, Charles reached for the person who had become his emotional anchor within the family. He reached for Kate. The room seemed to freeze. Conversations didn't exactly stop, but there was a subtle shift in energy as people sensed that something significant was happening. The assembled diplomats and dignitaries, trained in reading subtle social cues, recognized that they were witnessing something that went beyond normal royal protocol. Kate responded without hesitation. She immediately moved toward Charles, her face showing genuine concern rather than formal duty. She didn't look around to see who was watching or consider what the proper protocol might be in such a situation. She simply responded to someone she cared about, who clearly needed support. When she reached Charles, she took his outstretched hand in both of hers, her touch gentle but steady. "Charles," she said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of intimate concern that family members use with each other during moments of crisis. "Are you feeling all right? Do you need to sit down?" The physical connection between them lasted only a few seconds, but in those moments, something profound was revealed to everyone in the room. This wasn't the formal relationship between a king and his daughter-in-law. This wasn't the carefully choreographed interaction between two people fulfilling royal duties. This was something real, something human, something that spoke to the genuine bonds that had formed within the royal family beyond the public protocols and formal expectations. Charles steadied himself, his color beginning to return, but he didn't immediately release Kate's hand. For a few seconds more, he held on to the connection with someone who had become, in ways that even he was only beginning to understand, one of the most important people in his life. Not romantically. Nothing could have been further from the truth, but in the deep, complex way that families form bonds that transcend official relationships. William watched the interaction with a mixture of concern for his father and recognition of something he had observed growing stronger over the years. He had seen how Charles and Kate's relationship had evolved from formal courtesy to genuine affection, but this moment crystallized something he hadn't fully appreciated before. His wife had become something more than a daughter-in-law to Charles. She had become a bridge to emotional connections that Charles had sometimes struggled to access with his own children. Camilla, who had noticed the disturbance and was making her way across the room, arrived just as Charles was regaining his composure. Her reaction was telling. Rather than showing any surprise or concern about her husband's instinctive reach for Kate, she showed only relief that Charles was receiving the support he needed. Over the years, Camilla had come to understand and appreciate the special bond between Charles and Kate, recognizing it as something that enriched rather than threatened their family dynamics. The moment might have passed as simply a brief health scare at a diplomatic reception, but several factors ensured it would become something much more significant. First, the room had been full of experienced diplomatic observers who understood the significance of reading between the lines of official interactions. Second, there had been photographers present to document the reception, and at least two of them had captured the moment when Charles reached for Kate. But, perhaps most importantly, the gesture revealed something that had been building for years but had never been so clearly demonstrated in such a public setting. Charles's instinctive reach for Kate showed the world that the relationships within the royal family were more complex and more human than public perception often suggested. It showed that real bonds had formed that went beyond duty and protocol, that the monarchy was, at its heart, still a family dealing with the same fundamental human needs for connection and support that affected everyone. As Charles recovered his composure and the reception gradually returned to its normal flow, the impact of what had just happened began to ripple through the room. Conversations resumed, but with an underlying awareness that something significant had been witnessed. The carefully maintained boundaries between public and private, between formal duty and personal connection, had been crossed in a way that revealed truths about the royal family that protocol normally kept hidden. Kate remained near Charles for the rest of the reception, not hovering obviously, but staying close enough to provide support if needed. Her natural grace allowed her to maintain conversations with other guests while keeping a subtle eye on Charles's condition. William, too, stayed closer to his father than he might normally have done, the family instinctively forming a protective circle around Charles while still fulfilling their diplomatic obligations to the assembled guests. The evening concluded successfully in terms of its diplomatic objectives, but everyone present understood that something much more personally significant had occurred. As the guests began to depart, and the formal portions of the evening wound down, Charles found himself reflecting on the moment when his instincts had overridden his training, when his heart had directed his hand toward the person who had become, in ways he was only beginning to fully understand, one of his most important sources of emotional stability and family connection. The moment when Charles reached for Kate instead of Camilla would be analyzed and discussed in the days and weeks that followed, but its immediate impact was to reveal something profoundly human about the relationships within the royal family that protocol and public perception often obscured. In reaching for Kate, Charles had shown the world that the bonds formed within families, even royal families, could transcend official roles and formal expectations, creating connections that were both personally meaningful and historically significant. The silence that followed Charles's spontaneous gesture was unlike anything Kate had ever experienced during a royal engagement. It wasn't the respectful quiet that sometimes accompanied formal ceremonies, nor was it the brief pause that occurred when a monarch entered a room. This was something deeper, more complex, a moment when an entire room full of experienced diplomats and royal watchers realized they had witnessed something that revealed more about the inner workings of the British royal family than years of official statements and carefully managed public appearances. As Charles steadied himself with Kate's gentle support, the assembled guests seemed to collectively hold their breath. The High Commissioner from Canada, who had been in the middle of discussing trade relationships just moments before, found himself wondering if he should pretend he hadn't noticed anything unusual or if the moment called for some kind of acknowledgement. The representative from Australia, a nation where Republican sentiment often focused on the perceived distance between the monarchy and ordinary people, was struck by how utterly human and relatable Charles's instinctive reach for support had been. Kate could feel the weight of attention from every corner of the room, but her focus remained entirely on Charles. She had spent years learning to navigate the complex demands of royal life, but in this moment, all of that training fell away. She wasn't responding as the Princess of Wales or as someone fulfilling official duties. She was responding as a daughter-in-law who genuinely cared about her father-in-law's well-being. "Perhaps we should find you somewhere quiet to sit down for a moment," she suggested softly, her voice carrying the kind of intimate concern that family members reserve for each other during moments of vulnerability. Charles nodded gratefully, and Kate began to guide him toward a small antechamber adjacent to the main reception room where he could recover his composure away from public scrutiny. William immediately fell into step beside them, his expression showing the kind of protective instinct that had developed over years of watching his father navigate the immense pressures of royal duty. The three of them moved together with natural coordination, a family unit responding to crisis in a way that transcended official protocol and revealed the genuine bonds that had formed between them. As they reached the entrance to the antechamber, Camilla appeared at Charles's other side. Her response to the situation was as revealing as Charles's original gesture had been. Rather than showing any surprise or concern about her husband's instinctive reach for Kate, she simply focused on ensuring Charles had the support he needed. Her understanding of the dynamics within their family was evident in how naturally she accepted Kate's central role in this moment of crisis. "Shall I ask the staff to bring some water?" Camilla inquired practically, her voice showing the kind of calm competence that had made her such an effective partner for Charles over the years. She understood that her husband had developed relationships within their extended family that enriched rather than threatened their marriage, and her response to this situation demonstrated the security and wisdom that came from that understanding. The antechamber provided blessed relief from the public scrutiny of the main reception room. Charles sank into a comfortable chair while Kate knelt beside him, checking his pulse with the kind of practical concern she had learned from years of dealing with minor medical emergencies with her own children. William stood nearby, clearly torn between concern for his father and awareness that their absence from the reception was probably being noticed by the assembled guests. "I'm fine," Charles insisted, though his voice still carried traces of the disorientation that had prompted his reach for Kate. "Just felt a bit overwhelmed for a moment. Too much excitement, perhaps." He looked directly at Kate as he spoke, his expression showing gratitude that went beyond simple thanks for assistance. In his moment of vulnerability, she had responded with exactly the kind of calm, caring support that had made her such an important part of his life. Kate remained kneeling beside Charles's chair, one hand resting gently on his arm in a gesture that was both comforting and protective. "You've been working too hard," she said with the kind of gentle authority that came from genuine affection. "These receptions are important, but not as important as your health." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Charles's private secretary, who had noticed the family's absence from the main reception and come to check on the situation. His expression showed the kind of professional concern that came from years of managing royal crises, both large and small. "Is everything all right, Your Majesty?" he inquired, already mentally calculating how to manage any necessary adjustments to the evening's schedule. Charles waved away his concern with returning strength. "Just needed a moment to catch my breath. We'll rejoin the guests shortly." But even as he spoke, his eyes returned to Kate, and it was clear that her presence beside him was providing something beyond simple physical support. In a life filled with formal relationships and official obligations, Kate represented something authentic and unguarded that had become increasingly precious to him. As Charles recovered his strength, the conversation in the antechamber revealed layers of family dynamics that were rarely visible to public scrutiny. William discussed his environmental foundation work with the kind of passion that clearly pleased his father, while Kate shared observations about the cultural programs she had learned about from various Commonwealth representatives. The interaction was natural, unstrained, the kind of family conversation that occurred when people genuinely enjoyed each other's company. What became clear during those quiet moments away from public attention was how much Kate, had become the emotional center of gravity for this particular family constellation. She wasn't just William's wife or Charles's daughter-in-law. She had become the person who facilitated connections between family members, who remembered important details about everyone's interests and concerns, who created space for the kind of authentic interaction that could be difficult to achieve within the formal constraints of royal life. Camilla, watching the interaction between Charles and Kate with shrewd understanding, recognized something that many observers had missed. Charles's relationship with Kate wasn't about replacing anything or anyone. It was about healing something that had been broken for a long time. Kate had somehow managed to bridge the gap between Charles and William that Diana's death and years of complicated emotions had created. She had become the family member who made it possible for father and son to connect without the weight of history and regret that sometimes complicated their direct interactions. When they finally prepared to return to the reception, Charles insisted on a private moment with Kate. As William and Camilla moved toward the door, Charles caught Kate's hand again, this time with deliberate rather than instinctive intent. "Thank you," he said simply, but his eyes conveyed something much more complex than gratitude for assistance during a moment of physical weakness. "You've given me something I didn't know I was missing until I found it again." Kate understood that he wasn't just referring to the support she had provided during his brief health scare. He was acknowledging something that had been building between them for years, a relationship that had become one of the most important connections in both of their lives. She had given him a bridge to his son, a reminder of what family warmth could feel like within the constraints of royal duty, and a connection to someone who shared his commitment to the monarchy's future while bringing fresh perspective to its challenges. "You don't need to thank me," Kate replied softly. "This is what family does for each other." As they rejoined the reception, the assembled guests maintained their diplomatic composure, but the subtle shift in energy was unmistakable. Conversations resumed, but with an underlying awareness that something significant had been witnessed. The carefully maintained boundaries between public and private, between formal duty and personal connection, had been crossed in a way that revealed truths about the royal family that protocol normally kept hidden. The remainder of the evening proceeded smoothly in terms of its diplomatic objectives, but everyone present understood that the real story of the Commonwealth reception had been the moment when a king had instinctively reached for the daughter-in-law who had become one of his most important sources of emotional stability and family connection. The gesture had revealed something profoundly human about relationships within the royal family that would be discussed and analyzed long after the formal business of the evening had been forgotten. As the guests began to depart, Kate found herself reflecting on how much her life had changed since she had first entered the royal family as William's shy girlfriend. She had become not just a princess or a future queen, but a bridge between generations, a healer of old wounds, and a person whose presence had somehow made it possible for this complicated family to find new ways to connect with each other. The moment when Charles had reached for her would be remembered as revealing something essential about who they had all become together in the days that followed the Commonwealth reception. The image of Charles reaching for Kate, instead of Camilla, became one of those rare moments that transcended typical royal news coverage and entered the realm of genuine human interest. The photographs captured by the reception's official photographers showed something that couldn't be staged or manufactured, a spontaneous gesture that revealed the authentic relationships that had developed within the royal family away from public scrutiny. The British press, normally focused on protocol breaches and royal scandals, found themselves covering something entirely different, a story about genuine family bonds, healing, and the unexpected ways that relationships can evolve within even the most formal institutional frameworks. Editorial writers who had spent years analyzing the monarchy's future found themselves discussing something much more personal and emotionally resonant than constitutional questions or public opinion polls. Kate herself was surprised by the intensity of public reaction to the moment. She had responded instinctively to someone she cared about who needed support, but the public seemed to understand that they had witnessed something that spoke to larger questions about what the monarchy meant in the modern world. Letters poured into Kensington Palace from people who had been moved by the image of a family member reaching for another family member during a moment of vulnerability, regardless of official titles or formal protocols. The response from Commonwealth nations was particularly significant. Representatives who had attended the reception reported back to their governments that they had witnessed something that changed their understanding of the British royal family's internal dynamics. The gesture had shown that real human connections existed within the institution, that the monarchy wasn't just about ceremony and tradition, but about people who cared for each other in authentic ways. Charles found himself reflecting deeply on what the moment had revealed, not just to the public, but to himself. In his 75 years, he had rarely allowed himself to acknowledge how much he needed emotional support and genuine connection within his family. His upbringing and training had emphasized duty, service, and the subordination of personal needs to institutional requirements. But his instinctive reach for Kate had shown him something about his own emotional needs that he hadn't fully recognized before. The relationship between Charles and Kate continued to evolve in the weeks following the reception. Their conversations became more open, more personal. Charles found himself sharing concerns about the monarchy's future that he had previously kept to himself, while Kate offered perspectives that combined respect for tradition with understanding of how younger generations viewed royal institutions. Their bond had always been strong, but the public acknowledgement of its significance seemed to free both of them to be more authentic in their interactions. William watched the development of his father and wife's relationship with growing appreciation for how much it had contributed to healing old wounds within their family. The connection between Charles and Kate had created space for William to develop a more relaxed, less fraught relationship with his father. With Kate serving as a bridge between them, father and son found it easier to connect over shared interests and concerns without the weight of past disappointments and misunderstandings. The impact on Charles's grandchildren was perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of the strengthened bond between Charles and Kate. George, Charlotte, and Louis experienced their grandfather as someone who was deeply loved and appreciated by their mother, which created permission for them to develop their own close relationships with him. Kate's respect and affection for Charles gave the children a model for how to relate to him that went beyond formal royal protocol. Camilla's response to the increased closeness between Charles and Kate demonstrated the wisdom and security that had made her such an effective queen consort. Rather than viewing Kate's special relationship with Charles as competition, she recognized it as something that enriched Charles's life and made him happier and more emotionally fulfilled. Her acceptance and encouragement of the bond between Charles and Kate became a model for how royal families could function when personal relationships were allowed to develop naturally rather than being constrained by rigid protocol. The public's fascination with the moment at the Commonwealth reception reflected deeper questions about authenticity and human connection in public life. In an era when political leaders and institutions often seemed distant and calculating, the image of Charles reaching for Kate represented something that people recognized as genuinely human and emotionally honest. It reminded viewers that even within the most formal institutions, real relationships could develop that transcended official roles and duties. Royal biographers and historians began to analyze the moment as a turning point in public perception of the monarchy. For years, discussions about the royal family's future had focused on constitutional questions, public opinion polls, and institutional reforms. But the gesture at the Commonwealth reception had shown something different, that the monarchy's survival and relevance might depend less on formal structures than on the authentic human connections that could develop within the institution. The international response was equally significant. Royal families from other monarchies noted how the British royal family had managed to show both dignity and humanity simultaneously. The moment had demonstrated that it was possible to maintain institutional respect while allowing genuine personal relationships to be visible to the public. This balance between formality and authenticity became a model that other royal houses studied and attempted to emulate. As months passed, the impact of the moment continued to ripple through various aspects of royal life. Charles began to incorporate more personal elements into his public speeches, speaking about family relationships and emotional connections in ways that had previously been considered too informal for royal communications. Kate found that her public engagements generated different kinds of response. People seemed more interested in her perspectives on family life and personal relationships, recognizing her as someone who had genuine influence within the royal family beyond her official duties. The relationship between Charles and Kate became a symbol for how traditional institutions could evolve and adapt while maintaining their essential character. Their bond represented the possibility that formal structures could accommodate authentic human connections, that duty and love could coexist, that institutional requirements need not prevent the development of genuine family relationships. Looking back on that evening at Windsor Castle, Charles often reflected on how a moment of physical weakness had revealed something much stronger. The network of genuine relationships that had developed within his family over years of shared experiences, mutual support, and growing appreciation for each other's unique contributions to their collective life. His reach for Kate had been instinctive, but it had revealed something that was deeply intentional: the creation of family bonds that transcended official roles and formal expectations. Kate, for her part, came to understand that her role within the royal family extended beyond her official duties as Princess of Wales. She had become a bridge between past and future, a healer of old wounds, a creator of new possibilities for authentic connection within institutional constraints. The moment when Charles had reached for her had publicly acknowledged something she had been building privately for years: a place within the royal family that was based on genuine relationship rather than just formal obligation. The lasting impact of that moment at the Commonwealth reception was to show the world that the British royal family had found a way to be both traditionally royal and authentically human. In reaching for Kate instead of Camilla, Charles had revealed that the monarchy's greatest strength might not be its ceremonies or protocols, but its capacity to nurture genuine human connections that could inspire and move people across cultural and generational boundaries. The gesture had lasted only seconds, but its significance would endure for generations, representing a moment when authentic emotion transcended formal protocol and revealed the human heart that beats at the center of even the most traditional institutions. It showed that love, in all its complex forms, remained the most powerful force for healing, connection, and hope, even within the ancient walls of Windsor Castle and the formal structures of constitutional monarchy.